Welcome to the Sparkroom webinar series. Sparkroom provides full-service, data-driven marketing and technology solutions to ignite your performance marketing. Our webinars provide actionable advice and insight to help you better strategize, execute, analyze, and optimize your marketing campaign efforts.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Under the Microscope, 6 Data Insights that help uncover your best consumer prospects. My name is Michelle Verlin, and I'm the Marketing Manager here at Sparkroom. Before I introduce our presenters, let me give you a little background on Sparkroom and LeadiD. Sparkroom is a leader in performance marketing for the higher education industry. We provide fully transparent, analytics-based strategies that are designed to do one thing: achieve your enrollment marketing objectives. On your screen, you can see the 2015 Leads Council Leader Awards that Sparkroom recently won. These awards showcase the two sides of our business: a gold award for best marketing agency and a silver award for most valuable technology. LeadiD is the data and analytics platform that provides marketers with the trust and transparency to make smarter decisions and take real-time action based on verified consumer behavioral intent. It is the only independent, neutral, open technology platform that allows marketers to know the certified origin, history, and network intelligence of every first or third-party lead, creating a standard data currency for the lead generation ecosystem to communicate and optimize. Our fabulous presenters today are LeadiD from Sparkroom and Adam Figueira from LeadiD. In Liz's role as the Director of Analytics at Sparkroom, she works with some of the top brands in higher education to develop successful enrollment marketing strategies. She employs performance analysis and database decisions to optimize campaigns. Adam runs the marketing department at LeadiD and is a seasoned award-winning marketer with more than 10 years of experience. His background is in e-commerce and search engine marketing. Before Liz and Adam begin, let me alert you to a few housekeeping items. First, I'd like to point out some functionality on your webinar control panel, which is located in the top right corner of your screen. If you can't see it, look for an orange box with an arrow. If you click on the arrow, the box will expand. If you have any questions during the session, please type them into the questions box and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Secondly, I'd just like to assure everyone that early next week, I'll be emailing all of you a recording of this webinar, as well as a PDF of the presentation deck. Again, thank you for joining us, and I'll pass things over to Liz, who will get us started.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. For those of you who work in or around the digital marketing space, it's probably not breaking news that big data has changed every way that organizations look at and interact with their customers. The numbers out there about the sheer scale of data available are pretty hard to even wrap your head around. Stats like Google processing over 100 billion search queries last month, or Facebook users sharing over 2.5 million pieces of content in a single day, and over 204 million emails being sent every day as well. And those are just a few examples of some of the crazy large numbers around consumer digital activity in 2015. Both LeadiD and Sparkroom's business models revolve around trying to get all this information into manageable formats and outputs that can actually help marketers and not just bury them under piles of data. But even after we've gotten, for example, a customer's interaction history down from thousands of data points to a single record, there's still hundreds of associated attributes that may or may not be helpful when looking for ways to optimize your marketing spend. So that leaves a lot of information to try and make sense out of as marketers look for ways to be smarter and more efficient about what we do. And understanding that is the key to continually improving customer acquisition strategy, since the data we collect about each individual is the DNA of these prospects: who they are, where they're coming from, what they know about you, and what they know about your competitors, and so on and so forth. So understanding key details about each person your brand interacts with means you can then reverse engineer those to create more meaningful interactions.
Thanks, Liz. Now, a lot of marketers have heard the data into insight into action mantra in the past, and you probably can't scroll through your LinkedIn updates without seeing at least 20% of the companies talking about it. But for many marketers, the leap from priority to execution has remained really elusive. And what I mean by that is a lot of the solutions came onto the market talking about actionability, but if marketers are working with the same sets of data, looking at the same things, and by the way, that includes the same sets of data that maybe their competitors are looking at, why should the marketer really expect to get different results? So let's go to the next slide. I think the right question to really ask is, what's the right data? What should I be looking at? And what can I be looking at that maybe my competition doesn't have much visibility into? Because it's in answering these types of questions that opportunity reveals itself. And so I'll turn things back to Liz, who will start us off by looking at the major categories of data, and its categories, not just individual metrics, that we at LeadiD and Sparkroom have each found to be really impactful for the companies that we work with. Liz?
Great, thanks. So we'll go ahead and start with our first category today, which is consumer experience. Consumer experience is quickly becoming one of the most complex topics for marketers. And part of the reason for that is the fragmentation of the current media space, with many more channels and touch points than existed 10 or 20 years ago. But part of the complexity also has to do with how much agency a prospective consumer has when it comes to how they choose to discover, research, and choose specific brands over others. Today, the number of prospective paths consumers can take to get from point A to point B to point C, et cetera, are virtually infinite. So analyzing these possible experiences between and within these marketing moments usually yields a few main paths, but then a really, really long tail of various iterations. But it also creates a lot of noise for marketers to parse through to find out what's actually happening. For marketers, it's important to be able to translate those hows of the various consumer paths into whys that help them understand why someone followed a specific order of channel interactions, or why a certain creative seems to generate more response than others, amongst other insights. Our research has shown a roughly 27% lift in lead volume from consumers who had prior brand exposure via display or social ads, and a 22.5% lift in customer acquisition. But there's really a lot more to it than that. For example, how recently someone was exposed to creative can help identify whether certain placements are better at generating a direct response or at increasing brand awareness. The sole focus on last click conversion credit is pretty outdated at this point, especially as tracking of view-through conversions improves. But knowing the time lapse between that initial brand exposure and lead submission can help identify your better early versus late funnel messages, and then place them in front of the right people at the right times. And then how many times someone was exposed to an ad before converting is also helpful to know, particularly in identifying what the effective frequency is for each of your advertising channels. Effective frequency is a pretty standard marketing metric that quantifies what the ideal amount of exposures to a brand is in order to drive conversion. Not too many, which can be a waste of money and possibly annoying for consumers, but not too few, which aren't generating response. What's interesting about effective frequency today is how much it varies by channel and even by device. For example, a display ad on a desktop or tablet device usually hits effective frequency from anywhere between 2 and 10 impressions for non-retargeting campaigns. But then a display ad served on a mobile device typically has a much higher effective frequency of anywhere from 15 to even 25 times due to smaller ad formats and other mobile-related factors. So knowing exactly when your ads start losing effectiveness is helpful in understanding why you need to set varying frequency caps in each channel at the right point and what those right points actually are. And finally, context is the last piece of that how picture. Putting consumer paths into the context of things like starting point, creative, actions taken, and so on are important in measuring their value. And that context can be used to help change up that buying experience based on what works and what doesn't, both dynamically and then over a longer optimization period. Drilling into this a little bit more means translating the why to how much. In other words, is the prospect you're in front of close to making a purchasing decision, or are they further out at the time they submit a lead? One way we do this is by looking at which keywords are driving those impressions, clicks, leads, and customers. The results from our own 2015 paid search benchmarking report are shown here to help illustrate the dynamics that we typically see. There's an inverse relationship between brand and general keywords, share of impressions, and customers, with the bulk of our impressions coming from the more expensive general keywords, but the bulk of customers coming from brand terms. In other words, general keywords are often providing an early funnel or assisting connection between consumers and a brand, offering that initial exposure, whereas brand keywords are more often assisted, meaning they are probably not deserving of all the credit they receive and are actually being supported in a lot of ways by those general keywords and other brand exposure channels. Tracking this data all the way through to that offline conversion phase is really important because it can help marketers understand the value of their keywords in contexts like these in both the brand and more general categories. A good keyword portfolio is one that contains a mix of these two types, but a really smart, optimized keyword set contains all of these, plus bids that take into account the relative values of the keyword in the context of where they could be in the customer acquisition funnel, based on where they are and how they're searching at the time of conversion. This lead level and keyword and cross-channel exposure data helps to describe the prospective customer experience that underlies acquisition attribution modeling, something that many marketers today are becoming increasingly familiar with. It adds a layer of intuitive understanding around how many exposures are effective, which channels are driving them, and what kind of context existed around that first, converting, and last touches in successful marketing campaigns. There's really no single attribution model that works for every marketer or even every vertical in our experience. But knowing the relative value of each stage allows you to perform a reality check on your attribution model and balance costs throughout the entire journey. Based on a combination of customer insights and machine-based learning, you can adjust spending to create a fully optimized spending plan, one that assigns the right value and weight to every component along the way. And now I'll hand it back to Adam to talk about our next area of focus, marketing channel.
Great, thanks, Liz. As we continue on this journey of trying to uncover where our best consumer prospects are, the next thing that we want to look at is the channel by which the lead is generated. And mainly that just means, did it come through a web form, or was it generated by a call center making an outbound call? And what we've seen is that in the education industry, about 75% of leads come from the web and a quarter come from call centers. And in addition, we've seen that leads from call centers are about 24% less likely to turn into an actual enrollment. But that's just part of the story here. So let's dig a little deeper and go to the next slide. It turns out that call centers are very effective at making contact with consumers and performing that warm transfer to an enrollment advisor. And that makes sense because, you know, in the context of making that transfer, well, the call center already has that consumer on the phone. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the consumer has high intent. And that's really what we're talking about. The best consumer prospect is the one who has the intent to take a desired action. So it turns out that once contact is made, call centers are far less effective at converting the consumer into a student. So what's actually happening here? You know, why is it that the call center is great at making the warm transfer, but those calls aren't actually converting? Well, it turns out that consumers just have a hard time saying no on the phone. But when push comes to shove, they're just less likely to complete that enrollment process than the consumer who took the time to fill out that lead form on his or her own. So again, another indicator, another dimension that the marketer or the sales rep can look at to try to answer that question of, what leads should I prioritize? Where should I focus my time? Who should I, pursue the most? And channel is a big factor here. Liz, why don't you tell us a little bit about device?
Yeah, so we'll flip through now to device and talk a little bit more about how that has been impacting the customer journey, and certainly some of the things that we've started to find as we've been able to better track that cross-channel customer journey. Yeah, Adam, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the research?
Sure, absolutely. So, obviously, unless, anyone's been living under a rock over the past 5 years, you already know about the mobile revolution. But the question is, how are marketers capitalizing on this challenge or on the opportunity, depending on where you sit? And if we had done this webinar last year, we'd probably tell you that generators are better at getting leads from mobile devices. But if we were to fast forward to this year, it's actually the schools themselves who have gotten the edge. So let's go to the next slide and we can take a look at that. Now, we could go on ad nauseum in this webinar about best practices in mobile design. We could talk about things like, wanting to have a high contrast of colors on your mobile site or on your mobile form because people like to dial down the backlighting on their phone to save battery life, and so you want your forms to just be easier to see. But what does, again, all of this mean in the context of intent? At the end of the day, forms are more difficult to fill out on a mobile device than they are on a desktop. And while you can and should try to make your mobile forms easier to use, this is a fact that still rings true. Mobile forms are more difficult to fill out. And so getting through the form on a phone actually indicates higher intent, because effort and intent really go hand in hand here. And knowing something as simple as what device the consumer used can again help you prioritize the leads. And Liz, I know you want to dive a little bit deeper on this topic.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll take a little bit of a look at some of the research that Sparkroom has done just on some of the recent mobile trends from the customer's perspective as they're taking actions to get to know a brand a little better. So here you have some of our client search data from the first half of 2015, which we saw some really consistent gains for mobile and share of the search ad impressions, which you can see on the left here was by mid-year nearly equal with desktop devices, so definitely a huge gain in share there. And that trend actually shows more of a shift towards mobile when it comes to share of inquiries, shown in the graph on the right, which since February have had a majority coming from mobile devices. So these trends really highlight the need for mobile optimized websites and media, as well as a change in consumer preference when it comes to how they are choosing to research and then ultimately inquire about a specific brand. And as Adam mentioned, really knowing what device your customers are using at the time of impression, click, or lead submission is a really important piece of data for marketers to draw insights from for a few reasons. According to Google's research, about 90% of consumers use multiple screens sequentially to accomplish a task over time. And then on top of that, 98% actually move between devices within a single day when researching a topic. In our experience, use of various devices can send different signals about where a customer is in their research or decision-making process, which can be really important for marketers to know as they're deciding what creative to deploy and how to follow up with somebody. Using a mobile device, for example, can send a few different signals, including that someone is early on in the funnel. So we've seen that in many cases, particularly with search and digital display, customers may view or click an ad on a mobile device, but then ultimately use another device, such as their desktop or laptop, to actually submit a lead. It can also be an indication, too, that a prospect is looking for very specific information on the go. So click-to-call extensions are a really great way for advertisers to capitalize on this. And it also provides a performance boost just by being part of the ad. One of our recent tests showed that ads with click-to-call extensions end up generating more phone and also form-based leads. Desktop devices, on the other hand, are more often used as a last touch conversion point. Although these are often the final conversion point for users who may have done research using other devices, that is beginning to change a bit as more consumers do rely on mobile devices for their primary web access. But today, almost 70% of desktop or laptop activity still occurs at home, according to Google, and 40% of PC use is motivated by finding information. So unlike the need for short and action-focused mobile content, those accessing media from a desktop device typically consume more content and do so via multiple channels, either sequentially or simultaneously. For these users, the marketer's job is to reach across channels with a consistent theme and then provide the additional details needed to complete research. And then there are those accessing media via their tablet devices, which can play different roles in this multi-channel flow. So although this is stuck around 10% of total impressions and leads in our recent tracking periods, it's still important segment to account for. Research has shown that tablet devices are most often used for entertainment or shopping by consumers, but they're also commonly used as either the starting or ending part of that cross-device research flow, and are more often part of simultaneous media usage, meaning someone may be using their tablet while they're also watching TV, for example, or while they're using their smartphone. But the most important thing for marketers delivering ads and content across devices is to know which one is currently being used at the time of each interaction. That provides the opportunity to tailor things like experience with click-to-call functionality or expanded content depending on device, and then provide a consistent, convenient brand experience for users no matter how close they are to conversion. And next, we'll take a look at consumer engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And everything that you just said there, I think, is a great segue into this next topic, because we're going to see again how there's, where device intersects with the consumption of content and how that translates into performance. So let's talk about engagement. Engagement is all about how the consumer interacts with your brand. Now, one dimension of that is how long the consumer spends on your lead form. That's one indicator to look at, and it's important, and it's an important one. And there's again a distinction that you see here between mobile and desktop. Mobile users are willing to invest less time in your forms than someone using a desktop. But really, content is key here. So let's go to the next slide. If you're producing great content, then you're going to get more intentioned leads. And some of the leading indicators of that are many of the metrics that you see here: time on site, pages per session, session duration, and so forth. But I want to make an additional point, which is that how much information you ask for in a lead form and whether you actually get what you asked for is directly tied to how much value you provide in your content. You see, a lot of marketers talk about the optimal number of fields that you should have in a form. Is it 3 things? Should you ask for 5? I'm sure all of us have at one point or another seen a landing page form that had 10 or 12. The only thing they don't ask for is a DNA sample. But the answer is there's no right answer. There's no optimal number of form fields. If you provide a lot of value in your content, and on the landing page where your form is, and you make a compelling promise that you will deliver upon once I fill the form out, you can ask for more information, and consumers will take the time to fill it out. The key, though, is that there just has to be a match between what it is that you're asking for and what it is that you are providing in return. And again, that's all about content. Liz, what can you tell us more about, where bounce rate plays into all this?
Yeah, definitely. Bounce rate, I know, is one of the metrics that we here really rely on to tell us a lot about, first of all, our content, but also a lot of other aspects that help to describe ways that we can identify and fix potential ways or issues with the actual consumer engagement. So just to real quickly define bounce rate in this context, we're calculating this as the percentage of visitors who enter a website then leave without viewing any other pages. And it's a pretty standard metric that you can calculate within Google Analytics to kind of help figure out which pages are working and which aren't. So in terms of this metric being used to identify and fix issues holding customer engagement back, we have a few of those biggest ones listed here. And first is, of course, the content. Your best content is, as Adam described, the one that drives engagement and really prompts curiosity, providing value through to that consumer that they really get something out of and in turn feel that they can exchange, their information in return for. So if your content is resulting in a high bounce rate, you can probably infer that it's not doing what it's supposed to do as viewers and visitors are leaving your site. It can also be helpful in reviewing your keyword relevancy, though. If you're seeing high bounce rates for certain keywords, it could be that those keywords aren't connecting you with engaged prospects, or that your landing pages aren't what users expect to see after clicking on your ads. And the same goes for other traffic sources. If channels are sending traffic from individuals who aren't engaging with site content or who get to your website and immediately leave, they're probably not very valuable prospects. It can also help to highlight more low traffic but high engagement channels that otherwise may have been looked over a bit as part of your portfolio just because they aren't driving that same volume of inquiries. Page layout or site navigation is also closely linked to bounce rate. If users come to your website and then can't find what they're looking for, or the navigation is confusing, chances are they're going to give up and leave fairly quickly. So specific user paths that result in higher bounce rates can help highlight areas where users are getting hung up in your current layout and figure out ways to fix them. And finally, comparing bounce rate with certain audience segments by using Google Analytics or other website tools can uncover new demographic insights about your audience. Maybe certain pages or content are really resonating with some segments and not others, for example. Knowing that kind of info can help customize content and creative even further, or help uncover new audience segments that could provide you with good growth opportunities outside of your existing base. So here's one example of how we were able to define and track website and visitor engagement to measure how a really engaged visitor ended up behaving differently from a not so engaged visitor. In this case, really engaged translated to someone who had viewed more than 3 pages for a session lasting more than 180 seconds. Every marketer can and should have their own definition for what really engaged means to them, and this is just one example based on what we found helpful. So let's look at 2 metrics specifically here: visitor to lead conversion rate and enrollments for this higher education marketer. This represents their 2 main targets: getting someone to submit that initial inquiry and then someone who will follow through and actually enroll in classes. And for both metrics, you can see that engaged visitors behaved much differently from the site average. The conversion rate for really engaged visitors is over 150% higher than the average, and that same visitor segment accounts for full 99.5% of the enrollment sourced to the website. So it's clearly a great deal of value in the engaged consumer, and finding ways to identify and improve your site's engagement levels can have very real impacts to your lead and customer acquisition. And now we'll move on to our next factor: competition and in-market activity. There's a very good chance that unless you are offering a very specific niche product, you're competing with a number of other local and possibly national or global competitors for every single prospective customer. Today's consumer is bombarded with ads targeted to their interests and purchasing behavior, and precise targeting and programmatic advertising makes it really easy now for multiple marketers to identify in-market consumers and message to them. After all, someone who's buying what you're selling is a good thing, provided you're ready to act quickly and begin building that brand awareness and value proposition early and in front of your competitors. Otherwise, consumers can easily find and connect with other marketers, giving them the advantage in conversion potential. Here's a snapshot of Sparkroom data that helps to illustrate that. On the left, there's a percentage of how many inquiries came from a sample of prospective customers within a 7-day window, a metric that LeadiD calls Consumer Week. Our data show that 48% of consumers had, at the time of submitting an inquiry, only inquired at one organization. The number of prospects who then inquired 2, 3 times and more drop off from there. But it's still a pretty significant amount until you get into that long tail of consumers who inquired more than 8 times. But over half, as you can see, 52%, are inquiring more than once. So that certainly tells a pretty strong story about the fact that consumers are really not just choosing to engage with a single organization. And on the right, we have the lead to customer conversion rates that correspond to each of these Consumer Week categories. So it's clear that the organizations reaching a prospect who's only submitted 1 lead, or only submitted 1 lead at the time that they got that, are seeing significantly higher conversion rates. But even the 2nd and 3rd inquiries still have a better than average chance of becoming a customer. Things drop off after that, but as you can see, some marketers are still having some level of success with customers submitting inquiries to a number of competitors. So while it's great to be able to identify someone who's in the market for your service or product via programmatic or very interest-targeted advertising, it's really even better to identify when you're the first one in line to talk to that prospective consumer. And Adam, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of your findings around that?
Yeah, that's great, Liz. And I think there's a really important insight in what you just said. And so there's one dimension here, which is how many forms did a particular consumer fill out? And knowing that number can translate into an expected conversion rate. There's another side to this as well, which is how, when that consumer actually clicked submit and sent their information, how many other companies actually received the lead. And it probably surprises no one that leads are sold multiple times. It's part of the business model. But knowing how many companies, if any, have received the lead before you can help you predict, how likely you are to convert it. So what we see, for example, is that although only 6% of education leads are sold more than 3 times, if you happen to be the 4th school to receive it, you are 54% less likely to convert it than the 1st school that received it. So order really matters here, and I think this speaks directly to what you just said, Liz, on the previous slide. It is directly related to how many forms that consumer is filling out, because the more that they're spreading themselves out across the number of forms, each school is going to be less likely to be able to convert it. We see the same thing on the recipient side of this as well.
All right, so we've talked a lot at this point about consumer behaviors and how to analyze the resulting data to identify those top prospects via some of our metrics like engagement and experience, and how someone behaves is definitely important. That's a very big piece of this puzzle, but so is who the person is who's submitting the inquiry. So let's take a look now at how demographics can be used to help flesh out a marketer's consumer insights. We'll start with our sample prospect, who we've been able to spend a little time getting to know via his behavioral signals. So in this case, he started out by searching on his mobile phone for general product information, then landed on a website after a little bit of research. Although he then left without converting, he did visit 2 competitors' websites and submit inquiries within the past 7 days, meaning that this is definitely an in-market consumer, but someone who's already talking to competitors. So as we just saw, probably starting to diminish in value a bit. However, this individual did come back after doing a brand name search and submit an inquiry on his desktop computer. In the process, he spent a few more minutes and time on site researching through the website, including a visit to other customer testimonials. So all this information, as we learned from our careful data collection and analysis of these behavioral signals, add up to what looks like a pretty engaged guy looking at your services. But what if it's not who you expected? What if, in fact, you have 2 consumers exhibiting the same behaviors, but fitting extremely different demographic profiles? Our prospective customer on the left is a younger, more affluent male living in an urban area who's really into sports. On the other hand, our prospective customer on the right is a middle-aged, middle-class woman who lives in the suburbs and has a very different set of interests and motivating factors, as well as media preferences. The ideal marketing message and follow-up strategies are very different in these cases, so the implications of understanding and responding to each prospect's profile are significant. And so it's important to account for these demographic differences as well, whether it's through third-party data services that help give a more complete picture of the consumer, or self-disclosed information, which you get from surveys, site information, etc., in order to make sure the entire brand experience is one that's better tailored to each individual, not just based on their behavioral signals, but also based on their demographics. And demographics can also be used to help understand how to target media spending geographically as well. In our example here, the 2 prospects come from 2 slightly different regions within the same area, the greater metropolitan New York City area. Both can be really expensive places to advertise, so precise targeting is key in making sure marketing dollars are well spent. So when we look for each of these consumer profiles in their respective areas, Manhattan on the left and suburban New Jersey on the right, there are pockets within these areas that are going to be more likely to be home to a higher proportion of our targeted audience segments. These are heat maps of the density of the respective key segments by census tract, with dark orange meaning a higher concentration of our targeted demographics, and light blue meaning the lowest concentration. In other words, dollars are going to go a lot further in those more densely populated tracts than in others. There are large concentrations in Midtown and Lower Manhattan for New York City targeting, as well as about 10 miles west of the city for the New Jersey side. These can be used as core areas for affiliate, paid search, and other media campaigns, which provide the ability to be really specific with targeting and can help create a lot of efficiency with media spend. On the flip side, there are areas further uptown in the Bronx and further to the west of New York City that have significantly lower concentrations of our targeted demographic segments. Avoiding these regions when planning marketing spend can help to save dollars that can then be reinvested towards areas where your audience is more likely to be found. And another benefit of knowing who your consumer demographics are is that you can look outside the immediate areas where you already know your customers are coming from and find lookalike targeting opportunities to help you grow in different regions. In this case, there are areas in Brooklyn, Queens, and even Long Island that have higher concentrations of the right prospective customers. And on the other side of the Hudson, there are some concentrations further north and east of our core audience base that merit some targeting as well. So by understanding the audience demographics alongside of your consumer behavior signals, marketers can be smarter about such larger marketing strategies such as dynamic messaging or content, geo-targeting, and then growth opportunities in a really data-driven, savvy way. So now that we've got our ideas of how to get to the data that matters, well, how are we going to bring it all together? After all, it's great to know a lot about your consumers based on their various behaviors and demographic profile, but to paraphrase Thomas Edison, what are you going to do about it?
So what we saw, Sparkroom and LeadiD working together, we sponsored the 2015 Education Benchmarking Report through the Leads Council, and based on the answers that you gave us, nearly 70% of respondents said that they wish they had more behavioral data in making decisions about their online leads. And we at LeadiD have been working a lot recently on delivering a solution around this. So a lot of schools score leads using demographic-based information, and there's value in that, as you just heard Liz say. But there's another part of the story, and what we've been able to do at LeadiD is build a model that helps schools identify high-intention students who might score low in a demographic model, but on the flip side, identify students in a great demographic who maybe lack intent. And this is something that we call consumer intent score. So what you're looking at here, I sort of want to draw your attention to the left. You're looking at performance deciles for demographics, where 1 is the top decile and 10 performs the worst. Well, when you only have visibility into demographics, what can often happen is you'll reject those leads that are expected to perform the worst, which might be in deciles 8, 9, and 10, as you see it segmented here. But let's go to the next slide. What happens when you can layer behavioral data into all of this? What you'll probably discover is that you're incorrectly accepting and working and pursuing leads that look great from a demographic standpoint, but don't really score as well in terms of behavioral intent. On that top part of that chart, behavioral model deciles down at 9 and 10. These are leads that are in that favorable demographic profile, but they really didn't score low from an intent standpoint. And let's go to the next slide. Conversely, you might be rejecting leads because they don't look good in terms of demographics, but behavioral intent is actually high, very high, in fact, and that's called consumer intent score. Liz, tell us about Sparkroom's solution.
Yeah, and in a very similar fashion, we've found a way to do just that. So take the demographic attributes that we know about a prospective consumer and combine them with this combination of consumer actions and behaviors that we're gleaning from sources such as LeadiD to really create a very holistic view of the customer and the prospective value. And in order to turn that into real-time decision support, we built business rules and software functionality that allow marketers to score incoming leads in real time based on those attributes that are most important to them, whether it be combined or specifically demographic or more heavily on the behavioral side, and then take action to help streamline the sales pipeline in response. And this functionality helps us make sure that these insights are taking that next leap and actually turning into actions that help save marketers money. And in general, we recommend one of the 3 approaches, but depending on things like business model, priorities, and overall strategy, each marketer is going to find varying levels of value in each of these approaches. So we'll go through each of these real quickly. First, marketers can choose to reject leads that have scores below a certain threshold. For those that buy high, large lead volumes, so really large-scale businesses or businesses with multiple locations, removing those at the very bottom of the scoring scale, those that are most unlikely to convert before they're actually entered into the sales follow-up process, can help lower operational costs and make better use of existing capacity instead of spending time talking to consumers who just aren't high-intentioned or aren't fitting that current customer profile. The drawback to this system is the potential to miss out on prospective consumers in that group who, while they're less likely to become a customer, may still ultimately end up converting. Another option that we've used in the past is to reprice leads falling in different quality buckets. This is especially helpful to use for cost per lead based media channels such as affiliate networks. So instead of rejecting leads outright, this option would allow marketers to right price their media buys in real time, assigning value in the form of cost per lead up and down a varying scale based on that score and the anticipated quality that would come out in the actual cost per customer acquisition. The caveat in this model is that there will still be the same volume of leads, which may or may not be a benefit to some marketers. But the big upside here is that you're really being able to right price those inbound leads in a dynamic way that's really, I think, very fair to both the buyers and the sellers on each side of the equation. And finally, the last option is to reprioritize outbound lead follow-up efforts based on projected value. So that can be something as simple as assigning leads to certain sales reps based on score, or as complex as using different contact methods like email for some segments, phone for others, text for others, based on the likelihood of that individual to convert and the dollars and resources that go into each of those specific contact methods. So this can help make better use of existing resources while you're still able to reach out to all of the prospects. Marketing costs do remain constant in this approach, but those businesses with costly or resource-intensive follow-up processes can really see a big efficiency boost as a result that can really help to offset those constant marketing costs. But no matter what approach you choose to take, the important thing that I think we can all agree here is that the best source of prospective customer insights and the most valuable marketing tool any business has is its consumer behavioral and demographic data. And being able to cut through the noise and get to the good stuff within that big data pool should make your data collection analysis a bit more effective right out of the gate, and then allow you to continue to improve on that and to continue to be smarter and more effective about what you're doing. And with that, I want to thank everyone for your time and attention today and open things up for whatever questions we have.
Great, thank you so much, Liz and Adam. Now, as Liz said, we will take some questions. So if you have any, please type them into the question box in your webinar control panel. If you can't see the control panel at the moment, look for the orange box with the white arrow. Click on that and the control panel will pop out. Okay, let's see. It looks like we have already received some questions. The first one will be, what types of content are most effective for generating leads?
Yeah, so I'll take a first stab at that. I think it really depends on how you think the consumer wants to, for lack of a better word, consume the story or consume a particular piece of information. So, in the pantheon of content marketing, you've got everything from ebooks to white papers, webinars, like we're on today, and different media are conducive to different things. If you're trying to ultimately tell a very short, very succinct story that is meant to be easy to grasp, I would say, go with an infographic. That's a very effective way of delivering something like that. But if the idea is more complex, it requires more explanation because on the surface of it, it's not necessarily, easy to grasp, then possibly a white paper where you have more real estate, so to speak, to work with to actually communicate that. So I think a big part revolves around how the consumer wants to digest a particular story or piece of information, and how succinctly, as a marketer, you're able to deliver it. Luckily, you have all these different options available to you, and I don't think that any of them are mutually exclusive. I'm a big advocate of trying to repurpose as much of your content as possible into different media. So for example, if I wrote a white paper, I might try to also deliver it out in 3 to 4 blog posts, or I might have an infographic that actually goes along with it. And so you're able to capitalize or get as much scale as possible out of a particular story by working on it through all these different options that are available to you.
Yeah, I think that those are great points, and I think that's really consistent with what we've seen, that it really should be dependent on what the particular consumer is looking for out of that, and I think a lot of that can be picked up through some of the things that we talked about today. So if someone on a mobile device, maybe in that case you want to make your content shorter or something that is a little bit more responsive, maybe has a quick blurb and then an 800 number, for example, or a testimonial and then a form would pop up. So, I think that's part of it. And then something too, just to add in, that we've seen is, depending on the channel, rich media is also a very effective form of content. So, we recently did an email engagement campaign where we used videos as part of the content and saw a really great response there. Certainly Instagram for a lot of marketers is becoming a really big way to reach out to and to cultivate very engaged followers amongst prospective customers and also just, current customers to really create kind of a sticky level of engagement. So, I think definitely looking at how that person wants to interact with you is important, and providing content that fits the multiple channels and multiple devices is really important to kind of make sure that that's customized to that person at where they are in the purchasing decision.
Great, thank you so much, Liz and Adam. Okay, let's see. Our next question is, how is consumer intent affected by the order in which a lead is received?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and some of the slides that we showed earlier where Liz talked about the number of forms that a consumer filled out and how that translated to conversion rate, and then I approached it from the angle of how many schools or companies are receiving it. All that sort of factors in together here, and I think the important thing to understand is that as a marketer, you're interested not only in how likely the consumer is to convert in a general or abstract sense, you're really interested in how likely the consumer is to convert with you. And so when you think about how a consumer submits their information, and then that goes out to the first company and to the second company and then to the third company, when you as a company are farther down the line, you're number 3 to receive it or number 4 to receive it, that consumer has probably already been contacted by one of the schools that received the lead before you. And so while the consumer may have a high desire to convert, to become a student, or to do whatever it is that they're looking to do, their intent to convert with you is actually lower because you're a little late to the game in terms of when you received it. So that plays into it as well.
Yeah, and I think when we've used that metric in the past too, so kind of where is that person in terms of inquiring to competitors versus a single institution, we've really found a drop off after about 3 or 4. Things tend to start to really diminish in returns there. And it goes back to kind of something we were talking about earlier where, knowing that somebody is in the market is important, right? So programmatic advertising is huge these days. It helps to identify people who would be looking for the product that you're offering and gets them at the time when they're really ready to go out and purchase. And obviously, as more and more marketers leverage that, there's going to be more and more competition. So, the notion of exclusive leads being the only valuable ones is definitely, I don't think entirely accurate, but, certainly being there first and understanding kind of where you are in that priority and understanding if you're the 9th or 10th organization to have received that lead, that you've probably got to prioritize it a little bit differently is important.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, if working with vendors, what's the best tactic that you can use to provide the most valid leads to clients? How do you filter out the best vendors?
So I'll start with that one. So I think, certainly watching the feedback that you're getting from vendors via things like an intent score, combined intent demographic score is extremely important. And it goes to kind of some of the last points that I was looking at in terms of how you actually now take action on those insights. So in general, we like to give vendors and new third-party sources about 3 to 4 to 5 months to really kind of get a good data sample and see how they're performing, and then really take the results of their campaign, the leads they generated, and match that to CRM data to see, okay, what are they producing and kind of what are the correlating behavioral signals. But then it's really a matter of understanding how the vendor generates leads to understand if it's a reject, reprice, or reprioritize strategy that would make the most sense in approaching it. For example, when we work with vendors that are generating their leads via SEO-based sites and very high quality, highly engaged consumer traffic, we tend to say, maybe it makes sense to only look at a very, very low scoring percentage of their leads, the very, very bottom to take out, versus a much higher, for example, call center based affiliate, in which case you may want to look at rejecting more, just knowing that they have more inventory, that they are typically selling non-exclusive leads, et cetera, and you might want to be a little bit more selective about what you're getting from them.
Yeah, I would reiterate everything that Liz said. I mean, the key to this is, taking time to get a statistically significant amount of data, analyzing it properly, and then optimizing purposefully. You don't want to work too quickly because you may, or too far ahead of the curve, so to speak, because you may not be acting with the best set of data possible. And I'll add one other point as well. We spent a lot of time on this webinar talking about mobile. We talked about it in the context of call center performance. We talked about it in the context of consuming various content assets. But a really important thing to keep in mind is that a usable mobile website is not necessarily a useful mobile website. And I'll say that again. A usable mobile website is not necessarily a useful one. So usability is all about responsive design, and you have to be responsive. Probably more than 50% of your visits, your conversions are coming through mobile devices. So responsiveness is essential, but it's also just a ticket to entry. After that, you still need to be focusing on delivering what it is that your prospects actually want. And so understanding what they care about, what their pain points are, and then working that into your content is essential. You have to start with what the pain is and then work it into your content, as opposed to going in the opposite direction, which is starting with your content and then trying to find an audience for it.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how can you identify a single prospect across multiple channels?
Yeah, that's the $10,000 question, I think. A few years ago, I think it was really a shot in the dark. But these days there's a lot more ways and a lot more technology platforms that will allow you to identify someone and then track them across their different devices. So, a lot of the closed platforms such as Facebook and Google that allow for very specific audience targeting are really great ways to kind of make sure that you are targeting the same person across multiple devices and really effectively messaging to them no matter how they transition from their tablet to their phone to their laptop. But it's definitely still something that's a work in progress. So I think really working with advertising platforms and potentially third parties that can help you make sure you're really creating an authoritative ID for each prospective user is important. I mean, just creating that one single ID point, if it's email address or phone number, and making sure that it's established and used throughout all your marketing efforts is important, because otherwise you really lose a lot of the consistency that today's multi-channel and multi-device user is expecting.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, email address is one example of a key piece of information that can help you reconcile identities across devices, but it's one of those things that you probably don't know about it until the form is actually submitted. So, once it's submitted, you can say, okay, well, Adam, we know that he submitted a form with this email address on his desktop. He just submitted another, on his mobile phone. Now we can put all that information together. But as a marketer, you probably didn't know about it until I actually clicked submit and put my information there. So, but as Liz said, this is a very important question for the industry, and it's one that's still being worked on in a lot of cases.
Now, can this sort of intelligence be applied to inbound call leads as well?
I think there's similarly a way to begin to get that. I think it's something that, again, people are working on when it comes to things like click-to-call extensions from a mobile device versus kind of an 800 number called from a TV ad. I think it's really important to also make sure that you've got the right tracking solutions in place to make sure that you're breaking out calls so that the admissions reps or the call center reps or customer service reps know that somebody is calling from a mobile phone based on that 800 number extension, for example, versus calling after responding to a very specific TV spot. So, I think the same type of context and experience and engagement type metrics need to be applied to inbound call volume, and certainly, creating a very reliable picture of the consumer as soon as possible after getting that inbound call. Really often it's going to rely on third parties to help flesh out that customer profile.
Yeah, and perhaps, one of the most important things, and we didn't necessarily talk about it in the webinar, but one of the most important things is just to be able to, to enable the consumer to interact with you in the way that they want to. Some people prefer to use email, some people prefer to use phone, but give them the option. That's probably of paramount importance. I remember reading a tweet a couple years ago from a content marketer up in Boston, and he said, the best time to call me is email. And, because a lot of people talk about, well, you should try before 8 a.m. That's when people haven't started their days yet. Or, between 2 and 3 p.m. That's when they're most likely to take your call. But this was one particular person's preference. The best time to call me is email. So provide that option to consumers, and you'll be that much more likely to get the outcome that you're looking for.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz and Adam, for all of your insight today. If anyone has any further questions or need additional information, please feel free to contact Liz at webinars@sparkroom.com or visit sparkroom.com, and you can contact Adam at marketing@LeadiD.com or visit LeadiD.com itself. Thank you again for joining us, and everyone, please have a great day.
Thank you for your time. For more performance marketing resources, including our series of on-demand webinars, go to sparkroom.com/resources.